He thought humiliating an ordinary woman would make him look important. But before this day was over, the entire bank would remember the moment a billionaire called her mom. The polished marble floors of Sterling Trust Bank reflected the morning sunlight as customers waited patiently beneath sparkling chandeliers, each person dressed in tailored suits, designer coats, and polished shoes that silently announced success. Then the glass doors opened, and Mary Ellis stepped inside wearing a faded gray coat, comfortable walking shoes, and carrying nothing more than a worn leather folder whose edges had softened with age. She walked slowly but confidently, her silver hair neatly tied back, her calm blue eyes scanning the lobby without the slightest hint of insecurity. A few customers looked up, exchanged quick glances, then looked away with subtle smiles that carried quiet judgment. Behind the premier banking desk, Rebecca Whitman noticed her immediately. Rebecca had spent years building the image of Sterling Trust as the bank for successful people, and in her mind, appearance always revealed status before paperwork ever could. She watched Mary approach with measured steps and instantly decided this woman did not belong in the executive service area. Before Mary could even speak, Rebecca forced a professional smile that never reached her eyes. "Ma'am, standard banking services are available on the first floor." Her voice was polite enough for policy, yet dismissive enough for everyone nearby to understand exactly what she meant. Mary answered gently, "I'm actually here because I need to authorize a transfer from my account." Rebecca's fingers paused above her keyboard. "Your account?" she repeated, almost amused. Several people waiting nearby lifted their heads, sensing the conversation shifting. Mary quietly slid an envelope and an old account booklet across the polished counter. Rebecca barely glanced at them before pushing them back with 2 fingers. "Executive transfers require verification. Perhaps someone helped you fill out the wrong paperwork." A young teller nearby looked uncomfortable but remained silent. The room grew noticeably quieter. Mary did not argue. She simply said, "I've been banking here for a very long time." Rebecca gave a restrained laugh that carried farther than she intended. "Our executive clients usually don't arrive looking like they cleaned out their garage before stopping by." A few customers chuckled under their breath, while others pretended not to listen. Mary's cheeks flushed for only a moment before her expression returned to quiet composure. She lowered her eyes, gently straightened the worn folder, and rested one hand on a small silver pendant hanging beneath her coat. Hidden inside that pendant was an old photograph no one in the lobby could see. Across the room, an elderly security guard noticed the gesture and frowned, as though the pendant reminded him of something he couldn't quite place. Rebecca leaned forward, her voice now loud enough for nearly everyone in the lobby to hear. "Before we waste more time, I'm going to need proof that this account actually belongs to you." Every nearby conversation stopped. Even the clicking of keyboards seemed to fade. Dozens of eyes settled on Mary as though she had suddenly become today's entertainment. She slowly opened the old folder, revealing carefully organized documents that had clearly been handled with extraordinary care for decades. Rebecca barely looked before shaking her head again. "These can be copied. We see this sort of thing more often than you'd imagine." Another uncomfortable silence followed. Mary looked toward a large bronze donor plaque displayed across the lobby wall. Hundreds of names were engraved there, but her eyes rested on only one: Nathan Hayes Foundation. A faint, almost invisible smile crossed her face before disappearing again. She whispered so softly that only she could hear it, "You always told me kindness would matter more than money." Rebecca mistook the whisper for confusion and sighed dramatically. "If no one is coming to assist you, I may have to ask security to escort you to customer service downstairs." The security guard hesitated instead of moving. Something about Mary's face, or perhaps the quiet dignity in the way she stood completely alone against an entire room, made him pause. None of them noticed the black SUV pulling silently beneath the front entrance outside. None of them saw the familiar figure stepping onto the sidewalk. And none of them had any idea that within minutes, the single word he would speak would erase every assumption they had just made. Mary did not move. She had learned many years ago that dignity often sounded quieter than pride. Her hands rested gently on the old leather folder while the whispers around her slowly grew louder. One woman wearing an expensive cream-colored suit leaned toward her husband and quietly said that people were becoming far too bold these days. A young businessman glanced at Mary, then at Rebecca, deciding with a slight nod that the manager was probably right. Social pressure settled across the lobby like invisible weight, and no one wanted to stand on the wrong side of what appeared to be obvious. Rebecca sensed the room agreeing with her, and her confidence expanded with every silent face. She folded her arms and smiled politely. If your paperwork is legitimate, customer service downstairs will be happy to verify everything over the next several business days. Mary looked up calmly. I cannot wait several days. The transfer needs to be completed before noon. Rebecca raised one eyebrow. Executive transfers are not rushed simply because someone demands them. The sentence landed with enough volume that several customers looked directly at Mary again. An older gentleman slowly shook his head as though disappointed by what he assumed was unreasonable behavior. The young teller beside Rebecca quietly reached toward the folder, hoping to review the documents, but Rebecca stopped her with a subtle movement of her hand. There is no reason to continue until proper identification is confirmed, she said firmly. Mary nodded once, then carefully removed a driver's license and placed it beside the account documents. Rebecca barely glanced at it before sliding it back across the counter. Identification alone does not establish ownership of executive accounts. The young teller hesitated. Perhaps I should check the account number. Rebecca answered without looking at her. That will not be necessary. The words created another uncomfortable silence. Mary noticed the hesitation in the young teller's eyes and offered her a warm smile instead of frustration. Thank you for trying. The kindness seemed to surprise the young employee far more than anger would have. Rebecca interpreted the exchange as an attempt to manipulate sympathy. She pressed a button beneath the counter, quietly alerting the lobby supervisor. Moments later, a neatly dressed assistant manager approached with cautious steps. Rebecca summarized the situation before Mary could speak, describing her as someone insisting upon access to an executive account without sufficient verification. The assistant manager studied Mary's face, then glanced toward the donor wall across the lobby. For a brief second, his expression changed, almost as though he recognized something familiar. But Rebecca continued speaking before he could finish the thought. We cannot allow exceptions simply because someone tells an emotional story. Mary gently interrupted for the first time. I have not told you any story. The words were soft, yet they settled heavily over the counter. The assistant manager looked down at the account booklet now lying partially open. One page revealed decades of transaction history, with dates stretching back farther than his own career. Before he could examine it more closely, Rebecca closed the booklet with one quick motion. Those records can be reviewed later, she said. Outside the massive front windows, the black sport utility vehicle had come to a complete stop. A driver stepped out first, opening the rear passenger door with practiced precision. Inside the lobby, nobody noticed except the elderly security guard standing near the entrance. His eyes widened ever so slightly as he recognized the distinguished man walking toward the building. He immediately straightened his posture, then looked back at Mary with growing disbelief. For the first time since she had entered the bank, someone in the room seemed to understand that the quiet woman standing alone at the counter might not be the person everyone believed she was. The elderly security guard instinctively stepped away from the entrance and adjusted his jacket, a gesture so subtle that almost nobody noticed except the assistant manager. His eyes remained fixed on the man approaching through the revolving doors. Every employee at Sterling Trust recognized Nathan Hayes the moment he entered the building, although very few had ever met him in person. At only 40 years old, he had transformed Hayes Technologies into one of the largest software companies in the country, and his charitable foundation had funded hospitals, schools, and scholarship programs across several states. He rarely visited any bank branch without advance notice, making his unexpected appearance immediately unusual. Rebecca noticed the movement near the entrance and quickly turned with a polished smile that she reserved only for distinguished clients. Her entire posture changed within a heartbeat. The confidence that had sounded almost dismissive moments earlier became flawless professionalism. Mr. Hayes, she said warmly as she stepped away from Mary. What an unexpected pleasure. We would have prepared the executive conference room if we had known you were coming. Nathan acknowledged her with a polite nod, but did not slow his pace. His attention appeared focused on something beyond the reception desk. Rebecca interpreted his silence as concentration and hurried to keep up with him. Several customers straightened their jackets, hoping to catch a glimpse of the famous entrepreneur. Quiet conversations instantly shifted from Mary to Nathan. The atmosphere that had been filled with judgment only moments before was suddenly filled with admiration. Mary remained standing exactly where she was, still holding her old leather folder with both hands. She did not call out. She did not wave. She simply watched Nathan with the same calm expression she had carried since entering the building. The assistant manager noticed something unusual. While everyone else admired Nathan with excitement, Mary looked at him with quiet affection, almost the way a parent watches a child who has been working too hard. It was a look that carried years instead of admiration. Nathan continued walking until he reached the center of the marble lobby. Then he stopped. Rebecca immediately stepped beside him. "If you are here regarding your foundation accounts, everything has already been prepared." Nathan did not answer. Instead, he slowly looked around the room before his eyes settled on Mary. For a brief second, his composed expression softened into something deeply personal. The tension inside the lobby shifted again. The young teller noticed it first. Nathan was not looking at Mary with curiosity. He was looking at her with unmistakable recognition. Rebecca smiled politely, completely unaware of what was about to happen. "We are currently resolving a verification issue with this customer," she explained. "Unfortunately, she insists that she has access to an executive account, but we have not been able to confirm her claims." Nathan's eyes never left Mary's face. The words seemed to disappear before reaching him. He quietly walked past Rebecca, ignoring the executive reception area entirely. Every polished shoe echoed across the marble floor. The entire lobby followed him with their eyes. Rebecca frowned in confusion before quickly following behind. The security guard lowered his head respectfully as Nathan passed. Mary finally allowed herself the smallest smile, one that carried relief more than expectation. Nathan stopped directly in front of her. For several long seconds, neither of them spoke. The silence became almost unbearable. Customers exchanged uncertain glances. Rebecca opened her mouth, preparing to apologize for the interruption, but Nathan gently reached forward, took Mary's weathered hands into his own, and his voice, filled with warmth that no business meeting had ever drawn from him, broke the silence in a way that instantly transformed every assumption inside the room. Then came the words that no one in the lobby could have imagined. "Mom." Nathan's voice was quiet, yet it carried through the vast marble hall with effortless clarity. "I have been looking for you all morning." Time itself seemed to pause. Rebecca's welcoming smile froze in place before slowly disappearing. The assistant manager blinked twice, uncertain whether he had heard correctly. Several customers instinctively turned toward one another, silently searching for confirmation that they had all witnessed the same impossible moment. Nathan gently squeezed Mary's hands before asking, "Why did you come here alone? You promised you would call me if you needed anything." Mary smiled with the warmth only years of unconditional love could create. "You were in meetings. I did not want to interrupt your work." Nathan shook his head with genuine affection. "Nothing I do is more important than you." The room fell into complete silence. The sentence echoed far louder than any accusation ever could. Rebecca felt her stomach tighten. Her eyes moved from Nathan's tailored suit to Mary's simple gray coat and back again, as though trying to solve a puzzle that refused to make sense. She forced a nervous laugh. "Mr. Hayes, there must be some misunderstanding." Nathan slowly turned toward her. His expression remained calm, but the warmth that had filled his face moments earlier disappeared beneath quiet disappointment. "What misunderstanding are you referring to?" Rebecca swallowed before answering. "We were simply following bank procedures regarding account verification." Nathan glanced at the closed account booklet resting on the counter. "Did anyone actually verify the account?" No one answered immediately. The young teller lowered her eyes. The assistant manager remained silent. Rebecca hesitated just long enough for the truth to become obvious. Nathan looked back at Mary. "Did they refuse to review your documents?" Mary answered exactly as she always had throughout her life, without anger and without exaggeration. "They were busy. I suppose appearances made the decision easier." Her gentle words carried no bitterness, making them even more difficult to hear. Nathan slowly exhaled. He remembered another building many years earlier, a crowded children's shelter where a young widow named Mary Ellis had quietly served meals, mended clothes, and comforted frightened children who had nowhere else to go. She had never officially adopted him because she could not afford the legal process. Yet she had raised him, encouraged him, and believed in him long before anyone else ever had. She had worked double shifts cleaning offices so he could buy textbooks, and when he earned his first scholarship, she celebrated as though she had won it herself. To Nathan, there had never been another word worthy of describing her except Mom. Rebecca noticed the emotion in his eyes and suddenly realized that this relationship reached far beyond charity or publicity. This was family, genuine family. The elderly security guard quietly removed his cap out of respect, remembering years earlier when he had occasionally seen Mary visiting the branch with a teenage Nathan wearing secondhand clothes and carrying borrowed books. Neither of them had looked wealthy then, but they had always smiled. Rebecca's confidence continued to crumble beneath the unbearable weight of the truth. Around the lobby, whispers changed direction. The same people who had quietly judged Mary's appearance only minutes earlier now looked at her with entirely different eyes. Yet Mary herself had not changed at all. She stood with the same calm posture, the same humble coat, the same weathered folder resting gently in her hands. Only everyone else's assumptions had changed. Rebecca's carefully rehearsed professionalism finally gave way to uncertainty. She looked toward the assistant manager, silently hoping someone else would explain what had just happened, but no one spoke. The young teller cautiously reopened the account booklet that had been dismissed only minutes earlier. Her eyes widened almost immediately. "This account has been active for more than 30 years, she said quietly. "There have never been any irregularities." The assistant manager stepped closer and examined the records himself. Every page reflected careful financial discipline rather than extraordinary wealth. There were years of modest deposits, years of careful saving, and later, larger transfers connected to charitable work. It was the financial history of someone who valued responsibility more than luxury. Nathan watched without interrupting. His attention remained on Mary, whose calm expression had not changed despite everything that had happened. "Mom," he asked gently, "what were you trying to do today?" Mary looked down at the folder before answering. "The Children's Learning Center needs a new roof before the rainy season begins. The contractor gave us until noon to complete the payment. I thought it would be easier if I handled it myself." Nathan smiled softly, though disappointment lingered in his eyes. "You still try to carry everything alone." Mary gave the smallest shrug. "You already carry enough." Those simple words settled over the lobby with remarkable weight. Several customers quietly lowered their eyes, embarrassed by how quickly they had accepted appearances as truth. Rebecca felt every memory of the past 20 minutes replay inside her mind. She remembered pushing away the documents without reading them. She remembered laughing. She remembered speaking loudly enough for strangers to hear. None of those decisions had been required by bank policy. They had been made because she believed she already knew who Mary was before allowing the facts to speak. Nathan finally turned toward Rebecca. His voice remained composed. "May I ask one question?" She nodded nervously. "When my mother first approached your desk, what information did you use to decide she did not belong in executive banking?" Rebecca opened her mouth, then closed it again. Every possible answer sounded worse than silence. Nathan did not raise his voice. Was it her account history? She shook her head. No. Was it her identification? Again she answered quietly. No. Nathan waited one more moment. Then it was her appearance. Rebecca lowered her eyes. Yes. The single word echoed more painfully than any accusation could have. Nathan looked around the elegant lobby. "This institution has protected my companies for many years because I believed it valued integrity above image. Today I watched the opposite happen." The assistant manager inhaled deeply, understanding the seriousness of the moment. He immediately instructed the young teller to complete Mary's transfer without further delay. Within minutes, the necessary documents were verified, the authorization codes were confirmed, and the payment for the Children's Learning Center began processing. It turned out that the entire transaction could have been completed in less than 10 minutes if someone had simply reviewed the paperwork from the beginning. Mary quietly thanked the teller for her kindness. The young employee smiled with visible relief. She realized that the greatest lesson of her career had arrived before lunchtime, and it had nothing to do with banking. Nathan looked once more at the weathered leather folder in Mary's hands. It contained decades of careful planning, sacrifice, and hope. Yet the most valuable thing inside that building had never been the documents. It was the quiet character of the woman who carried them with grace, even while an entire room underestimated her. The transfer confirmation appeared on the monitor with a quiet chime that seemed almost symbolic. A process that had been delayed by prejudice was completed in only a few minutes once someone finally chose to examine facts instead of appearances. The assistant manager personally printed every receipt and handed the documents to Mary with both hands, treating her with the respect that should have greeted her from the very beginning. Mary accepted them with a grateful smile. There was no triumph in her expression, no satisfaction at watching anyone feel embarrassed. She simply thanked him and carefully returned every paper to the worn leather folder that had traveled with her for decades. Nathan watched the scene in thoughtful silence. He knew his mother's greatest strength had never been determination alone. It had always been her ability to protect the dignity of others, even after her own had been questioned. Rebecca remained behind the executive desk, unable to escape the weight of what had happened. The polished marble floor, the expensive artwork, and the elegant surroundings suddenly felt strangely empty. For years she had believed that experience allowed her to recognize successful people the moment they entered the building. Today that confidence had collapsed under the quiet presence of a woman whose character had proven greater than every assumption made about her. Gathering her courage, Rebecca slowly walked around the counter until she stood directly in front of Mary. The entire lobby instinctively became quiet once again. Customers who had begun returning to their conversations stopped a second time, sensing that another important moment was unfolding. Rebecca lowered her head. "Mrs. Ellis, I owe you an apology. I judged you before I allowed your documents or your words to speak for themselves. I treated you with less respect than every customer deserves, and I am sincerely sorry." The apology was genuine, stripped of corporate language and rehearsed professionalism. Mary studied Rebecca's face for several seconds before answering. "We all make mistakes. The important question is whether we learn from them." Rebecca nodded slowly. "I hope I will." Mary smiled kindly. "Then today has not been wasted." Those simple words seemed to release a quiet breath throughout the room. Even the young teller smiled, realizing she had just witnessed forgiveness instead of revenge. Nathan placed one hand gently on Mary's shoulder. "You always teach better lessons than I ever could." Mary laughed softly. "That is because I have had more years to practice." A few customers could not help smiling with her. The tension that had dominated the lobby gradually gave way to something warmer, something unexpectedly human. The elderly security guard stepped forward carrying a small umbrella that Mary had accidentally left near the entrance earlier that morning. "I believe this belongs to you," he said respectfully. Mary thanked him by name, surprising him. "You remembered my name after all these years?" he asked. Mary nodded. "Kind people are difficult to forget." The old man looked away for a moment, clearly touched. Nathan noticed the exchange and quietly reflected on how naturally his mother remembered ordinary people while the world so often remembered only important titles. As they prepared to leave, the assistant manager announced that the executive office would be reviewing customer service procedures immediately, ensuring that every client would receive equal respect before assumptions were ever made again. Nathan appreciated the decision, but he knew the greatest change would not come from a new policy manual. It would come from every person standing in that lobby remembering the quiet woman in the gray coat whose character had proven far more valuable than the image everyone had expected to see. As Mary and Nathan slowly walked toward the entrance, the assistant manager hurried after them with one final request. "Mrs. Ellis, would you allow us to arrange transportation for you?" Mary smiled politely and shook her head. "Thank you, but I drove here myself. My little sedan has served me faithfully for many years. It still starts every morning, and that is all I need." Nathan laughed quietly. "She refuses to replace it no matter how many times I offer." Several employees exchanged surprised glances. The contrast was impossible to ignore. The woman connected to one of the nation's most successful entrepreneurs still measured value by reliability instead of luxury. Before they reached the revolving doors, Nathan paused and turned back toward the lobby. His expression was thoughtful rather than angry. "May I share one story before we leave?" No one objected. In fact, every person present seemed eager to hear whatever he was about to say. Nathan looked at Mary before speaking. 27 years ago, I owned exactly one backpack, 2 shirts, and a pair of shoes that had been repaired so many times they barely resembled shoes anymore. I believe my future had already been decided. He smiled gently at the memory. Then this woman welcomed me into a children's shelter where she worked. She never asked whether I could repay her. She never asked whether I would become successful. She simply believed that every child deserved to be treated with dignity. The lobby remained completely silent. She packed my lunches when there was barely enough food for herself. She stayed awake, helping me study for scholarship exams after finishing double shifts cleaning office buildings. When I wanted to quit because I thought college was impossible, she quietly reminded me that circumstances describe where you begin, not where you end. Nathan's voice softened. Everything people admire about me started with lessons she taught long before I earned my first dollar. Rebecca listened with tears gathering in her eyes. For the first time that morning, she no longer saw Mary as a customer. She saw a lifetime of sacrifice hidden beneath an ordinary gray coat. Nathan continued. People often congratulate me for building a successful company. Very few realize that the greatest investment anyone ever made was not financial. It was the time, patience, and kindness she invested in a frightened teenager who had nothing to offer in return. Mary gently touched his arm, slightly embarrassed by the attention. You made your own choices, she whispered. Nathan smiled. Only because someone first believed I could. The elderly security guard quietly applauded. One pair of hands became several, and within moments the applause spread naturally through the entire lobby. It was not loud or theatrical. It was respectful. Even the customers who had silently judged Mary earlier joined in, understanding that they were not applauding wealth. They were honoring character. Rebecca stepped forward one final time. Mrs. Ellis, if you ever choose to return, I hope we earn the opportunity to welcome you properly. Mary answered with the same quiet grace that had guided every moment of the morning. Treat the next person with the same respect you would have shown me today, even if you never learn their story. That will be more than enough. Rebecca nodded slowly, knowing those words would remain with her far longer than any formal training program. As Mary and Nathan walked into the bright afternoon sunlight together, the marble lobby behind them looked exactly the same as it had only an hour earlier. Yet every person still standing inside understood that something far more important than a financial transaction had taken place. Without changing her clothes, her voice, or the worn folder she carried, Mary had quietly transformed the way an entire room would look at strangers from that day forward. 3 days later, the story inside Sterling Trust Bank had already begun changing people in ways no policy update could measure. Employees greeted every customer with greater patience. Managers quietly reviewed long-standing procedures, and the young teller found herself remembering Mary's gentle smile whenever someone walked through the front doors dressed more simply than everyone else. Rebecca returned to work carrying an unfamiliar sense of humility. She no longer stood behind the executive counter assuming she could recognize success by clothing or confidence alone. Instead, she asked more questions, listened more carefully, and allowed every customer the opportunity to tell their own story before reaching conclusions. One quiet afternoon, the assistant manager approached her office carrying a small file. "You should see this," he said. Inside were letters from local charities thanking the bank for supporting community projects through the Nathan Hayes Foundation. Rebecca slowly turned each page until she noticed one familiar name appearing again and again. Mary Ellis. Her name never appeared as the primary donor. She had quietly organized volunteers, delivered supplies, mentored students, and served meals at shelters for years without asking that anyone recognize her contribution. Rebecca sat silently for several moments. She realized that while the world celebrated wealthy benefactors, many of those generous projects had survived because ordinary people like Mary had faithfully carried the daily work that cameras never recorded. That realization stayed with her long after the office became quiet. Later that week, Nathan invited Mary to visit the Children's Learning Center, whose roof had now been fully funded. Fresh lumber lined the parking area, workers measured new beams, and children laughed across the playground without realizing how close the repairs had come to being delayed. The center director welcomed Mary with genuine excitement. "Everything arrived on schedule because your transfer was completed before the deadline." Mary smiled with quiet relief. She watched children carrying backpacks far too large for their small shoulders, and for a brief moment, she saw Nathan exactly as he had once been. Nathan stood beside her and said softly, "You still choose to spend your time here instead of enjoying an easier life." Mary looked toward the playground. "This is the easier life. Helping people has never felt heavy." Nathan laughed gently because he knew she truly believed it. They walked through freshly painted classrooms where volunteers prepared bookshelves and teachers organized donated supplies. A little girl approached Mary holding a drawing made with colored pencils. "Miss Mary," she asked shyly, "will you hang this on the wall?" Mary accepted the picture as though it were priceless. Nathan quietly watched from across the room. Business awards, magazine covers, and financial milestones had never moved him as deeply as moments like this. He understood once again that his mother had never measured success by what entered a bank account. She measured it by the number of lives quietly made brighter. Before leaving, Nathan looked across the center and noticed a small plaque being installed near the entrance. It thanked every donor who had contributed to the renovation. Mary's name appeared among dozens of others in simple alphabetical order. Nathan smiled, then turned to the director. "Would you consider placing her name at the top? She made this possible." The director looked toward Mary before answering. "We already asked." She insisted every volunteer be recognized equally. Nathan smiled knowingly. That answer sounded exactly like her. As the afternoon sunlight filled the classrooms, children continued laughing, teachers continued working, and Mary quietly joined volunteers arranging books on new shelves. No one watching her would have guessed they were standing beside the woman whose quiet dignity had transformed an entire bank only days before. Yet Mary seemed happiest precisely because nobody was paying attention to her at all. Months passed, and the memory of that morning continued to travel far beyond the walls of Sterling Trust Bank. New employees heard the story during orientation, not because it involved one of the country's most respected entrepreneurs, but because it reminded everyone that the greatest mistakes often begin with the smallest assumptions. Rebecca became one of the strongest advocates for treating every customer with equal dignity. Whenever new staff members asked why she insisted on personally greeting people regardless of how they were dressed, she simply smiled and said that appearances had once taught her the most important lesson of her career. She never mentioned her own embarrassment. Instead, she spoke about the quiet woman who had shown grace when she had every reason to respond with anger. At the Children's Learning Center, the new roof protected classrooms through heavy storms, and the laughter inside the building never stopped. Families gathered for reading nights. Volunteers filled the library shelves with new books, and children who had once worried about leaking ceilings now dreamed about college, science, music, and futures that stretched far beyond their neighborhood. Mary continued arriving every Tuesday morning in the same dependable sedan, carrying homemade cookies, donated books, and endless patience. She never announced who she was, and most new families assumed she was simply another volunteer. She preferred it that way. Nathan visited whenever his schedule allowed, often arriving after long business meetings wearing the same tailored suits that appeared on magazine covers. Yet the moment he stepped into the learning center, he became something much simpler. He carried boxes, stacked chairs, repaired shelves, and listened to children proudly read their first stories aloud. Watching him work beside Mary, no one could easily tell which of them had influenced the other more. One autumn afternoon, a young volunteer asked Nathan a question that made him pause. "How did you become so successful?" Nathan looked across the room where Mary was kneeling beside a little boy, patiently helping him sound out difficult words from a picture book. He smiled before answering. "Success did not begin when I started my company. It began the day someone chose to believe in me before I had achieved anything at all." The volunteer followed his gaze toward Mary and quietly nodded. In that simple moment, the true measure of wealth became impossible to misunderstand. It was not found in investment portfolios, executive offices, or impressive buildings. It lived inside the people who quietly lifted others without expecting recognition in return. As the afternoon sun streamed through the windows, Mary gathered the empty cookie tray and placed it back inside her familiar leather tote. The same calm smile that had carried her through humiliation at the bank still rested gently on her face. Nothing about her appearance had changed. She still wore practical shoes, simple clothes, and carried herself with quiet confidence. Yet everyone who truly knew her understood that her greatest gift had never been generosity alone. It was the ability to see dignity in every person long before the rest of the world noticed it. Nathan walked beside her toward the parking lot, carrying the remaining boxes while she reminded him not to work too hard and to remember to eat dinner before another late meeting. He laughed exactly as he had when he was a teenager listening to the same advice. Some relationships are never defined by money, titles, or success. They are built through years of sacrifice, kindness, and unwavering faith in another human being. And on that quiet afternoon, just as on the unforgettable morning at the bank, the world offered the same timeless reminder. The clothes people wear may shape a first impression, but character is what leaves a lasting legacy. And genuine dignity never needs to announce itself for others to recognize its worth.